If your surname is Jamaican, chances are what you were told about it is a guest wearing the costume of a fact. A story from a grandmother. A rumor passed around after church. A cousin on Facebook who did the research and never once showed anyone an actual document. None of that is proof, and none of it survives contact with paper. In 1817, the British colonial government forced something into existence that folklore could never fake: a written register. Every enslaved person in Jamaica had to be recorded by name, age, color, occupation, and the estate that claimed ownership over them. This was not a legend passed mouth to mouth for 200 years, softened a little more with every retelling. This was ink, paper, a government clerk with no interest whatsoever in flattering anybody's family myth, filling in columns because the law demanded it. And when you actually open those pages, instead of repeating what you were told at a family gathering, the names you grew up trusting start telling a completely different story than the one in your head. Some surnames you assumed were purely African were not. Some you assumed were simple, generic British planter names hide a very specific twist nobody in your family ever bothered to mention. Today we crack open 7 of the most common Jamaican surnames and show you exactly what the 1817 registers say about where they came from. Not what the family story wants you to believe, and not what sounds nicest at a dinner table. Stay to the end, because the 7th name on this list will completely rearrange how you think about the difference between what a surname means and what it once did. Before we go further, subscribe now, because this channel exists to put real paper trails under Caribbean family names every single week, no guesswork included. And drop your surname in the comments below. We read every one, and yours might be the very next name we take apart on camera, register pages and all. Surname 1, Campbell. Start with a name that shows up on more Jamaican birth certificates than almost any other on this island: Campbell. Most people assume it means one thing: a direct, unbroken line back to some grand Highland clan chief, sword and tartan included, one big proud family tree with a single root. The 1817 registers tell a far less romantic story than that. Campbell was never one powerful family in Jamaica. It was dozens of unrelated ones. Small Scottish bookkeepers, overseers, and minor landholders scattered across parishes like Trelawney, St. Anne, and St. Elizabeth. Many of them men who arrived on the island with nothing after failed ventures back home and clawed their way into owning a modest handful of enslaved people rather than a sprawling estate with a great house attached. The registers list Campbell-owned enslaved people on properties that had almost nothing to do with one another, run by men who likely never even met each other in their lifetimes. So if your surname is Campbell, your ancestral paper trail probably doesn't lead back to one dynasty at all. It leads back to a scattered, unglamorous wave of Scots who show up in the record as ordinary, middling men, not clan royalty in a portrait frame. The myth was always bigger than the paperwork underneath it. Even the parish records themselves rarely agree on who these Campbells were related to, which tells its own quiet story. A name that spread wide because it belonged to opportunity rather than to any single bloodline. 2 Jamaicans named Campbell today may share nothing more than the fact that some distant ancestor on some distant estate happened to work for a man carrying that surname. Surname 2, Beckford. Next, a name that sounds almost decorative until you learn exactly what it financed: Beckford. Unlike Campbell, this one does not scatter into dozens of small unrelated holdings. The Beckfords were among the wealthiest absentee planters in the entire British Caribbean, with sugar estates stretched across Westmoreland and Clarendon that generated fortunes so enormous they helped fund extravagant building projects back in England that architecture historians still write essays about today. The people who built that wealth never got to see where it went. The 1817 registers show enslaved people recorded across multiple Beckford-owned properties, laboring to build a fortune their owners rarely had to witness firsthand, since the family mostly lived in comfort across the Atlantic, and let hired overseers run the daily operation. This is one of the clearest, most direct owner-to-surname transfers anywhere in the entire record. No scattered small landholders here, just one enormously wealthy family whose name got permanently stamped onto the lives of the people who actually generated that wealth for them. A name then carried forward, unquestioned, into every generation that followed. Walk through a Beckford entry in the register today, and you're not looking at a coincidence of naming. You're looking at the exact ledger line where a fortune and a family history were both created at once on the same page by the same pen. Surname 3. Barrett. Then there is Barrett, a name that pulls Jamaican family history directly into English literary history in a way most people never expect. The Barrett family owned Cinnamon Hill, an estate near Montego Bay that generated sugar wealth flowing straight into one of England's most famous literary households, ancestors of a celebrated Victorian poet whose family fortune was built almost entirely on that single Jamaican estate and on the people forced to work it for generations. The 1817 registers list enslaved people under Barrett-owned properties in St. James Parish. Page after page of names tied to one specific estate whose profits crossed the ocean and quietly funded a life of privilege and poetry thousands of miles away. If your surname is Barrett, you are not simply carrying a common, generic English name picked at random. You're carrying a direct paper link to one specific estate and one specific family, whose descendants became internationally famous for entirely different reasons, reasons that almost never mention exactly where that original fortune actually came from. It's a strange kind of inheritance. One family's name becomes a line in a poetry anthology, while another family carrying the exact same surname traces straight back to the register page that paid for it. Quick pause before we keep going. If names like this are already catching you off guard, subscribe now so you don't miss next week's list of 7 more. And while you're here, tell us in the comments below. Does your own surname match anything you've heard so far? Or does it belong on a completely different list entirely? One we haven't even gotten to yet. Surname 4. Palmer few names on this entire list carry more legend than Palmer. Most people who know it through the Rose Hall estate and the so-called White Witch story, a tale of a murderous plantation mistress that sounds like it belongs in a horror film, mostly because it was practically written as one for exactly that purpose. That dramatic version of Annie Palmer was largely invented decades later by a novelist chasing a gothic ghost story that would sell books, not by any historian carefully working from documents in an archive. Strip away the legend, though, and the 1817 registers show something quieter but far more solid. Real Palmer-owned estates, real enslaved people recorded by name in careful columns, real ordinary government paperwork sitting patiently underneath 2 centuries of embellishment and exaggeration. The real lesson with Palmer isn't the ghost story at all. It's realizing just how much of what circulates as history is actually fiction wearing a historical costume, while the actual, verifiable record sat completely untouched the entire time, waiting for someone to open it instead of the novel. Nobody needed a ghost story to make this history disturbing. The register alone does that without a single invented detail. Surname 5. Malcolm rarely gets mentioned in conversations like this one, but the register explains exactly why it deserves a seat at the table. Unlike the grand estate names we've already covered, Malcolm shows up in the record as smaller, quieter holdings scattered through parishes like Manchester and St. Elizabeth. This was never a name tied to one aristocratic dynasty with a great house and a family crest. It belonged instead to a wave of more modest Scottish settlers who owned a handful of enslaved people, rather than sprawling plantations stretching to the horizon. The 1817 entries under Malcolm read almost like a quiet census of the island's middle tier of slaveholders, the ones history books tend to skip right past in favor of the famous, headline-grabbing families. If your surname is Malcolm, the register places your line firmly among that overlooked middle group. Not the wealthiest names in Jamaican colonial history, but far from the smallest either, sitting exactly in the part of the archive most people never think to go looking through. It's a reminder that colonial Jamaica wasn't just built by a handful of famous estates. It ran on hundreds of smaller households like this one, each leaving behind just enough paperwork to prove they were there, even if history books never bothered to write their names down anywhere else. Surname 6. DaCosta breaks the entire pattern we followed so far, and that's exactly what makes it worth including. This is a Sephardic Jewish surname, carried by families of Portuguese Jewish origin who arrived in Jamaica by way of the Netherlands and England after fleeing religious persecution in Iberia generations earlier. Many DaCosta households appear in the 1817 registers not as rural plantation owners at all, but as merchants and traders based in Kingston and Spanish Town. though documentation also shows that some Sephardic households did hold enslaved people themselves, just within a very different economic world than the sugar states we've spent most of this video on. That means DaCosta traces back to a completely different chapter of Jamaican colonial history altogether. Trading houses and busy port town commerce, ledgers and shipping manifests, not cane fields and great houses. Not every surname on this island leads back to a plantation gate. Some lead back to a counting house on a Kingston Street corner instead, to a family already carrying its own long history of displacement before it ever set foot on the island. Proof that Jamaican surname was never one story, but several very different ones running side by side. Surname 7. Bogle. We saved the most surprising name on this entire list for last, Bogle. Most people who know this name know it through Paul Bogle, the Jamaican national hero who led the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865 and was executed by colonial authorities for standing firmly against injustice. It is one of the most historically significant Black Jamaican surnames there is, spoken with pride at ceremonies and taught in classrooms across the island. And yet on paper, Bogle is actually an old Lowland Scots surname, originally meaning something close to phantom or goblin, with no African linguistic root to it at all, a name that started life describing something eerie in the Scottish countryside. The 1817 registers show the name entering the enslaved population through Bogle-owned property in St. Thomas Parish, the exact same ordinary administrative process that gave dozens of other families their surnames that same decade. What makes this one different is the twist that followed only 2 generations later. A name once used purely to mark ownership became a name that marked open resistance to that very system instead. Very few surnames on this island carry that kind of complete, full-circle irony, a name assigned to a race identity that ended up permanently attached to one of the loudest acts of defiance in Jamaican history. Somewhere in that reversal is the whole story of this island in a single word. That's 7 surnames and 7 paper trails your family may never have had direct access to until today, sitting exactly where they've always been, waiting to be opened. If even one of these changed how you see your own name, subscribe to this channel, drop your surname in the comments below, and send this video to someone in your family who still believes the old, unverified version of the story they've been repeating for years. Next week, we open the 1817 registers again, and the names on that list only get harder to believe. Every family thinks their name is the exception until the paperwork says otherwise. See you then.